At 10 in the morning on a foggy Tuesday in September 1944, the deadliest predator in France was sitting in a tree line near Arracourt. It was a German Panther tank, 45 tons of sloping, hardened steel. It carried a high-velocity 75mm cannon that could punch through an American Sherman tank like a hot needle through butter. It was a masterpiece of engineering, designed by the best minds in Berlin to rule the battlefield. Above it, putting along at the speed of a drowsy pigeon, was its prey, a Piper L4 Grasshopper. If the Panther was a masterpiece, the L4 was a joke. It was built from mild steel tubing, wood, and cotton fabric. It had a 65 horsepower engine, barely enough to power a modern motorcycle. It had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and according to the United States Army manual, it had 0 weapons. The manual said this aircraft was an observer, a passive set of eyes. The manual said that if a pilot in an L4 saw a tank, his job was to pick up a radio, call for artillery, and pray the shells arrived before he was shot down. Major Charles Carpenter had read the manual, and right now he was about to use it as toilet paper. Carpenter didn't call for artillery. He pushed the nose of his fabric kite toward the mud. He throttled up his lawnmower engine and dove straight at the 45-ton steel monster. The German tank commander opened his hatch. He wasn't scared. He was confused. Why was this suicidal mosquito attacking him? At 100 yards, Carpenter flipped a switch. There was a whoosh of burning propellant, a streak of smoke, and then the physics of 1944 changed forever. The rocket didn't bounce off the thick front armor. It slammed into the thin steel of the engine deck. The Panther didn't just stop, it detonated. To understand why a sane man would strap infantry weapons to a plane made of bedsheets, you have to look at the scoreboard. In late 1944, the Allies were bogging down. The hedgerows of France were crawling with German armor. The Americans had air superiority, sure. They had P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. These were 2,000 horsepower aluminum sharks that patrolled the stratosphere. But down in the mud, the infantry had a problem. The P-47s were too fast. They flew at 300 miles per hour. By the time a pilot in a Thunderbolt spotted a hidden German tank, he was already past it. Enter the L4. The military called it a liaison aircraft. The pilots called it a Maytag Messerschmitt. It was slow, ugly, and cheap, but it had one superpower. It could fly low and slow. So slow that the pilot could lean out the window and shout at the guys on the ground. The doctrine was simple. The L4 pilot finds the bad guys. He radios the coordinates to a fire direction center. The center does the math. They call the battery. The battery loads the guns. They fire. The shells travel 5 miles. It sounds efficient on paper. In reality, it was an agonizing waiting game. This was the loop of death. Major Charles Carpenter was tired of the loop. He was 32 years old. He wasn't a career killer. Before the war, he was a history teacher and a football coach in Illinois. He was the kind of guy who molded young men, who taught them about teamwork and future. Now, he was watching those same young men get turned into pink mist by German 88mm flak guns while he sat in the sky, clutching a radio, waiting for permission to help. The frustration was eating him alive. He looked at his plane. It was essentially a bicycle with wings. The engineers at Piper Aircraft had designed it to carry 2 people and a radio. They calculated the drag, the lift, and the center of gravity down to the ounce. They said adding weight would make it unflyable. They said firing a weapon from the struts would light the fabric wings on fire. But Carpenter wasn't an engineer. He was a coach, and he knew that when your team is losing, you don't stick to the playbook that isn't working. You invent a new one. One afternoon, Carpenter landed near a supply depot. He saw a group of infantrymen cleaning their M1 bazookas. These were simple tubes, essentially stovepipes that fired a 2.36-inch shaped charge rocket. They were designed to be fired from a soldier's shoulder. Carpenter looked at the bazooka. He looked at the flimsy struts of his L4. He looked at his mechanic, Sergeant Walter Gammon. "Gammon," he said, "do you think we can strap these to the wing?" Gammon probably looked at him like he had grown a second head. The physics were a nightmare. The M1 bazooka creates a massive backblast of burning gas when fired. If you mounted it too close to the fuselage, you wouldn't just kill the tank, you'd burn your own tail off. If you mounted it too far out on the wing, the recoil and weight would snap the spar, and the plane would spin into the dirt. But they didn't write a memo to Washington. They didn't ask for a committee meeting. They got some baling wire and some electrical tape. They mounted 2 launchers, one on each wing strut, carefully angled to clear the propeller arc. For a trigger, there was no sophisticated solenoid. They wired the rockets directly to a cluster of cheap ignition switches taped to the pilot's left knee. It was ugly. It was unauthorized. It was a violation of every safety regulation in the Army Air Force handbook. They named the plane Rosie the Rocketer. When the other pilots saw it, they laughed. They called it a toy. They asked Carpenter if he planned to shoot down pigeons. They didn't understand the physics of tank warfare. They didn't understand that Carpenter had just accidentally discovered the weakness of every tank ever built. You see, a German Tiger or Panther puts all its armor in the front. The glacis plate is thick enough to stop a cannon shell. But the roof is thin steel, barely enough to stop shrapnel. It has to be thin, or the tank would be too heavy to move. On the ground, a bazooka has to face the thick front armor. But from the air, every tank is naked. Carpenter wasn't building a fighter plane. He was building a can opener. He took Rosie up for a test flight. The plane was heavy. It handled like a wet sponge. The drag from the tube slowed it down even more, but it flew. Now he just had to find out if firing the rockets would rip the wings off. He spotted a German armored car moving down a dirt road. He didn't radio it in. He didn't wait. He pushed the stick forward and let gravity take the wheel. The Mad Major was going to war. The first test was a moment of pure terror. Carpenter lined up the German armored car in his makeshift sight. He was flying at 60 miles per hour. The manual said the recoil of the bazooka would tear the fabric wing apart. The manual said the backblast would ignite the dope lacquer on the fuselage and turn the pilot into a falling fireball. Carpenter squeezed the trigger switch on his knee. There was a thunderclap right outside his left ear. The little plane shuddered violently. The smell of burning powder filled the cockpit. But the wing didn't fall off. The strut held. Down below, the rocket slammed into the armored car. It wasn't a glancing blow. The shaped charge punched through the thin steel, spraying molten metal inside the vehicle. The German car swerved into a ditch and began to burn. Carpenter pulled up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He checked his wings. There were scorch marks on the fabric, soot stains from the propellant, but no fire. The crazy idea worked. When he landed back at the airstrip, Sergeant Gammon ran out to meet him. He looked at the empty tube. He looked at the smoke rising in the distance. He didn't have to ask if it worked. Carpenter climbed out of the cockpit with a grin. He didn't want a medal. He wanted more firepower. 2 rockets weren't enough. If he was going to hunt the big cats, the Panthers, and the Tigers, he needed a barrage. Put 4 more on, he told Gammon. This was pushing the laws of aerodynamics to the breaking point. The L-4 Grasshopper was rated for a maximum takeoff weight of 1,200 pounds. With Carpenter, a full tank of gas, a radio, and now 6 M1 bazookas bolted to the struts, Rosie the Rocketer was flying dangerously heavy. The performance of the plane plummeted. The climb rate dropped to barely 200 feet per minute. It felt sluggish, heavy, and tired. It took almost the entire runway just to lift off the grass. It was no longer a graceful bird. It was a flying brick with a propeller, but it was a brick that packed the punch of a destroyer. Carpenter developed a tactic that was as simple as it was terrifying. He called it the glorious crash. He would climb to 1,000 feet and circle the battlefield, looking for the telltale exhaust smoke of German armor hidden in the tree lines. When he spotted a tank, he didn't dive immediately. He waited. He stalked. He used the noise of the battle below to mask the sound of his tiny engine. Then he cut the throttle and spiraled down. The physics of this attack were brutal. To ensure a hit with a dumbfire rocket that was wire-tied to a wing strut, Carpenter had to get close, insanely close. The effective range of an M1 bazooka is about 300 yards, but on a moving airplane, vibrating and bouncing in the wind, that range dropped to 100 yards. 100 yards is nothing in aviation terms. It is the length of a football field. It is pistol range. At that distance, Carpenter could see the mud on the tank's treads. He could see the commander's face. The Germans didn't know how to react. They were disciplined soldiers. They knew the silhouettes of Allied aircraft. They knew to hide from the P-47 and the P-51. But this looked like a recreational plane. It looked like a toy. At first, the German tankers didn't shoot. They assumed it was just a spotter. They were terrified that if they opened fire with their machine guns, the tracers would reveal their position to the American artillery. They followed their own manual. Hold fire. Stay hidden. It was a fatal mistake. They would watch the little plane dip its wing. They would see the flash of smoke. And then, a split second later, a 2-inch rocket would slam into the top of their turret. The psychological impact was devastating. The German crews began to panic. They felt safe inside their 60-ton Tigers. They believed their frontal armor made them invincible. But Carpenter was cheating. He was bypassing the shield and stabbing them in the back. Soon, the legend of the Mad Major spread across the front lines. The infantry loved him. They would cheer when they saw the beat-up little plane with the soot-stained wings buzzing overhead. It was personal for them. The fast fighter jocks at 20,000 feet were abstract heroes. Carpenter was one of them. He was down in the mud, fighting at treetop level. But the Germans were adapting. They realized that the little plane was not harmless. It was an assassin. The order went out to the flak crews and the machine gunners. Shoot the Piper Cub on sight. The sky became a lot more dangerous for Rosie. Every time Carpenter dove, the air filled with tracers. He had to dodge machine gun fire in a plane that was slower than a Volkswagen. He would kick the rudder pedals, slipping and skidding the plane sideways, dancing through the streams of lead. One afternoon, during the Battle of Aracourt, the stakes got higher. A column of German armor was counterattacking an American position. The U.S. troops were pinned down, outnumbered, and running out of ammo. The weather was bad. The big fighters were grounded. The fog was hugging the ground. Carpenter didn't care about the weather. He loaded Rosie with 6 fresh rockets and took off into the mist. He found the German column moving down a narrow road. It was led by a Panther tank and several half-tracks. They were moving to flank the American unit. If they got through, hundreds of men would die. Carpenter didn't have the element of surprise this time. The Germans heard him coming. The half-tracks opened up with 20mm cannons. Explosions popped all around the fragile plane. A single hit would tear the fabric wing in half. Carpenter pushed the nose down. He ignored the tracers flashing past his canopy. He focused on the lead Panther. He lined up the radiator cap on his nose with the engine deck of the tank. He was flying through a storm of steel in a paper airplane. At 150 yards, he fired 2 rockets. One went wide, exploding in the dirt. The other struck the rear of the Panther. The tank shuddered and stopped. Smoke pouring from the engine. The column ground to a halt, but Carpenter wasn't done. He banked hard to the left, narrowly missing a tree. He swung around for a second pass. He had 4 rockets left and an entire column of angry Germans to fight. He targeted a pair of armored cars that were spraying him with machine gun fire. He came in so low that his landing gear wheels were spinning from brushing the tall grass. He fired again. Another hit. The lead armored car erupted in flames. The German infantry, terrified by this relentless hornet, broke and ran. They abandoned their vehicles. They had faced artillery barrages and heavy bombers, but there was something unnatural about a tiny plane that refused to die and kept raining fire on their heads. Carpenter landed back at the base with his plane riddled with bullet holes. There was a piece of shrapnel embedded in the seat cushion, inches from his spine. Sergeant Gammon counted the holes. There were over a dozen. Carpenter just lit a cigarette and pointed to the empty rocket tubes. "Load it up again," he said. "There are still targets out there." By the end of the month, the score was unbelievable. The man who was supposed to be a passive observer, the history teacher in the flying bicycle, was credited with destroying 6 tanks and dozens of armored cars. He had officially become a tank ace. But the war takes a toll on machines and men. Rosie was getting tired. The engine was worn out from running at maximum power. The airframe was twisted from the G-forces of the dives, and Carpenter was exhausted. He was flying 3, sometimes 4 missions a day. He was living on coffee, cigarettes, and adrenaline. He knew that eventually the law of averages would catch up with him. You can't fly a fabric plane into a machine gun nest forever. But he also knew he couldn't stop, not while his boys were still down there in the mud. Then came the mission that almost ended it all. It wasn't a tank this time. It was a mistake. Carpenter was flying patrol near a dense forest. He saw what looked like a German tank hidden under camouflage netting. He rolled in for a run. He was tired. His eyes were stinging from the wind. He dropped down to 50 feet, finger on the trigger. Suddenly, the radio crackled. It was a frantic voice from the ground. "Abort! That's a Sherman!" Carpenter yanked the stick back. The plane groaned as he pulled out of the dive inches above the tank. He looked down. He saw the white star on the turret. He had been 1 second away from killing 5 of his own men. He climbed back to altitude, shaking. His hands were trembling so bad he could barely hold the stick. The stress was breaking him. The line between hero and tragedy was razor thin. He landed Rosie and sat in the cockpit for a long time. The silence of the engine was deafening. He realized that the technology, the rockets, the tactics, none of it mattered if the man inside the machine broke down. But the war wasn't over, and the Germans had one last surprise waiting in the Aracourt sector. A surprise that would require every ounce of luck the Mad Major had left. By October 1944, Major Carpenter and his battered plane, Rosie the Rocketer, were legends. But legends don't stop bullets, and the Germans were preparing a trap. Intelligence reported a high-value target moving near the town of Havricourt. It wasn't just a tank. It was a command vehicle, likely carrying senior officers coordinating the counterattacks. It was protected by a ring of mobile anti-aircraft guns called Whirlwinds, tanks with 4 20mm cannons mounted in a turret. They were designed specifically to shred low-flying aircraft. Carpenter knew this was different. Hunting a lone panther in a field was dangerous. Tacking a command convoy surrounded by flak wagons was suicide. The manual said to call in a squadron of P-47s. Let the big boys handle it with 500-pound bombs. But the weather was closing in again. The clouds were practically touching the treetops. The P-47s were grounded. If anyone was going to hit that convoy, it had to be a pilot crazy enough to fly below the weather. Carpenter looked at Gammon. They both knew Rosie was on her last legs. The engine was leaking oil. The fabric on the wings was patched in a dozen places. "Let's go," Carpenter said. He took off into the gray drizzle. Visibility was terrible. He had to fly by following the road, staying just above the power lines. He found the convoy parked near a farmhouse. It was heavily defended. He could see the ugly, boxy turrets of the Whirlwinds scanning the sky. This time, he couldn't sneak up on them. The moment he popped over the tree line, the Germans opened fire. It was a wall of lead. The sky around Rosie lit up with green tracers. Carpenter didn't have the speed to zoom climb out of danger. He didn't have the armor to tank the hits. He had to fly the plane like a leaf in a hurricane. He kicked the rudder, sliding the plane sideways. A 20mm shell punched a hole through the floorboard, passing right between his legs and exiting through the roof. If it had been 2 inches to the left, the war would have been over for Charles Carpenter. He kept diving. He focused on the command vehicle in the center of the ring. He was terrified, but his hands moved automatically. He was the coach calling the final play of the game. He fired his last barrage. All 6 rockets left the rails in a ripple fire. The recoil slowed the plane almost to a stall. Carpenter shoved the throttle forward, fighting to keep the nose up. The rockets streaked down. 2 missed. 1 hit a flak wagon, and 3 slammed into the command vehicle. The explosion was massive. The vehicle disintegrated. Carpenter banked hard, skimming the roof of the farmhouse. He looked back. The convoy was in chaos. The flak guns had stopped firing as the crew scrambled for cover. He had done it. He had decapitated the German attack force. He limped Rosie back to base. The engine was coughing. The oil pressure was dropping to 0. He landed on the grass strip and the propeller stopped turning the moment the wheels touched the ground. The engine had finally seized. Carpenter climbed out. He walked away from the plane and collapsed on the grass. He was alive. The war ended for Carpenter a few months later. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, a cancer of the lymph nodes. Doctors believed the stress of combat and the constant exposure to toxic rocket fumes had triggered it. The man who had survived German tanks and flak guns was being killed by his own body. He went home to Illinois. He went back to teaching history. He didn't talk much about the war. He didn't brag about the tanks. He just wanted to live a quiet life. But the cancer was aggressive. He fought it for 20 years with the same stubbornness he used to fight panthers. He died in 1966. He was 53 years old. For decades, the story of Bazooka Charlie faded. The big history books focused on the generals like Patton and Eisenhower. They focused on the atomic bomb and the jet fighters. The story of a history teacher in a canvas plane seemed like a footnote. And Rosie the Rocketer? She disappeared. Most people assumed the army scrapped her after the war. She was just a worn-out L-4, full of holes and smelling of oil. But in 2017, a miracle happened. An aviation historian named Rob Collings heard a rumor about an old Piper Cub sitting in a museum in Austria. It had been sold as surplus, bounced around Europe, and ended up gathering dust. Collings flew to Austria. He inspected the plane. He scraped away layers of paint on the wing struts. And there, underneath 70 years of grime, he found the faint outline of scorch marks. He found the mounting holes for the bazookas. It was Rosie. She had survived. The Collings Foundation bought the plane and brought her home to the United States. They spent years restoring her. They didn't make her look like a factory new plane. They restored her to her combat glory. They painted the invasion stripes. They reinstalled the rocket tubes. They even left the bullet patch on the floorboard. In 2020, Rosie the Rocketer took to the sky again. When the engine started, it wasn't the roar of a jet, it was the humble put of a lawnmower engine. But to the people watching on the ground, it sounded like victory. The legacy of Charles Carpenter isn't just about destroying tanks. It's about the idea that one person, with enough courage and a little bit of baling wire, can change the outcome of a battle. Today, we see his spirit in modern warfare. When you see cheap commercial drones dropping grenades on tanks in Ukraine, you are looking at the grandchildren of Rosie the Rocketer. The technology has changed, but the concept is the same. David doesn't need a giant sword to kill Goliath. He just needs a slingshot and the guts to use it. Most military manuals are written by committees in safe rooms. They tell you what's safe. They tell you what's possible. Charles Carpenter proved that the manual is just a suggestion. He proved that an engineer with a welding torch is dangerous, but a history teacher with a grudge is unstoppable. If this story inspired you, if you believe that sometimes the craziest ideas are the best ones, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that we want more stories about the guys who broke the rules to win the war. And make sure you're subscribed. We are digging through the archives every week, looking for the forgotten legends like Bazooka Charlie. Drop a comment below. What is the wildest field modification you've ever heard of? Have you ever had to fix something using just duct tape and prayer? I want to hear your stories. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing on the battlefield isn't the 60-ton tank. It's the guy in the flying bicycle coming up behind it. We rescue these stories to ensure Charles Carpenter doesn't disappear into silence.